What would you do if the most powerful man in America promised to protect you and then left you alone with a child the country refused to believe was his? In 2015, a small laboratory answer unsettled nearly a century of American history. DNA confirmed that President Warren G. Harding had fathered a daughter in secret. For decades, that claim had lived only in the voice of one woman, Nan Britton, a voice many people chose not to hear. This is where her story begins. But how does a secret survive inside the White House? And who decides which memories become history and which are quietly erased? Long before Washington marble and presidential portraits, there was Marion, Ohio, a railroad town with church bells that kept better time than clocks, a place where everyone knew which family sat in which pew, which porch light stayed on late, which girl walked home alone. Nan Britton was born here in 1996, the daughter of a middle-class family that believed reputation was a form of inheritance. Her father ran a small business. Her mother kept a careful household. They were ordinary people living inside an ordinary American dream. And in that same town lived a man who never quite felt ordinary, Warren G. Harding. He owned the local newspaper, spoke at civic dinners, shook hands like a candidate even when no election was near. Photographs from the period show a confident face, a man who understood how to be seen. According to Nan Britton's 1927 memoir, The President's Daughter, her early interest in Harding was the kind of admiration a teenager might feel for a well-known neighbor, distant, respectful, and innocent. Nothing in those early years suggested a scandal. Only a girl watching a public figure slowly outgrow the town that made him. But small towns have long memories, and sometimes those memories follow people farther than they expect. Growing beyond the map. By 1917, Nan had become an adult and left Marion for New York City. She worked as a secretary, typing letters she did not sign, learning how anonymous a person could feel inside a crowd. Harding, meanwhile, had been elected to the United States Senate. His life now belonged to trains and hotel lobbies, to party leaders who spoke in confident whispers. Britton later wrote that their first adult meeting took place in New York that year, a moment she described as the beginning of a private relationship. Historians would argue for decades about how to weigh her account. But something undeniable was happening. Harding was rising toward national power, and Nan Britton was drifting into his orbit. What happens when an ordinary life crosses the path of ambition? Who is changed, the powerful or the person who meets them? America in 1917 was not built for complicated women. A man could reinvent himself with a new suit and a good speech. A woman carried her reputation like fragile glass. Once cracked, it rarely healed. Harding was married to Florence Harding, a woman Washington reporters called the Duchess. She managed her husband's schedule, his speeches, even his moods. In photographs, she appears alert, protective, always watching the edges of the frame. Behind that public marriage, another story was unfolding.
What we know of that story comes primarily from Britton's own account, which scholars have examined but never been able to fully verify. And yet the account refused to fade. How much of history depends on who is allowed to speak first?
1919, the year everything split. In 1919, the country was restless. Soldiers returning from war, factories learning peace, politics preparing for the next contest. For Warren Harding, party leaders were beginning to whisper a new word beside his name, president. For Nan Britton, the year carried a different revelation. She discovered she was pregnant. Picture that moment. One young woman, one unborn child, and a man stepping toward the highest office in the land. Britton stated that Harding arranged discreet financial help through intermediaries, a claim later mentioned in several biographies, though never documented in official records. On October 22, 1919, she gave birth to a daughter. She named her Elizabeth Ann. The birth certificate listed no father. How do you protect a child whose very name could end a career? And how do you protect yourself?
Life inside silence. Raising a child alone in the 1920s required more than money. It required courage that rarely appeared in newspapers. Nan moved between apartments, accepting secretarial work when she could find it. Her sister helped with the baby. Bills were counted twice. Dreams were counted less. She kept letters she dared not show, told a few trusted friends a truth that sounded impossible. And while she learned how to be invisible, Warren Harding learned how to become unforgettable. Two lives moving in opposite directions, one toward the spotlight, one away from it.
The presidency arrives. In 1920, the country elected Harding as the 29th President of the United States. Crowds cheered his promise of a return to normalcy. After war and influenza, Americans wanted calm more than courage. To the nation, he was a symbol of stability. To Nan Britton, he was something far more complicated. The father of her child, a man whose face now hung in post offices. Those two versions of the same man could never meet. What does loyalty mean when it must live in the dark? A sudden ending. On August 2, 1923, Harding died unexpectedly while traveling in San Francisco. Contemporary newspapers reported national mourning, while quieter columns continued to speculate about his private life. Trains carried his body east as crowds lined the tracks, hands over hearts, hats held low. For Nan Britton, the moment was not only grief, it was the end of whatever protection she believed she had. The discreet support she described stopped. The letters stopped. The future she had imagined closed like a door. She was 26 years old with a 4-year-old daughter and a secret heavier than any suitcase. Most people would have folded that secret into silence. Nan began to imagine something braver.
The weight of a name. Think about the arithmetic of her life. A child asking why other children had fathers. A mother choosing words carefully at dinner tables. A country that believed presidents lived above ordinary mistakes. Nan understood that one day Elizabeth Ann would ask a simple question. Who am I? and she wanted an answer that could survive more than whispers. She also knew what speaking could cost: friendships, jobs, the thin protection of anonymity. Is truth still truth if it ruins the person who tells it? What history could not see. It is important to speak plainly here. Some details of Nan Britton's account were later supported by context and evidence. Others remain debated by historians. What is not debated is this: a child was born. A woman raised her largely alone, and in 2015, DNA would confirm that the man Britton named was indeed the father. But in the 1920s, there was no DNA. There was only a woman's memory against a nation's reluctance to listen. Without proof, how loud must a voice be to matter? The road toward a decision. By the mid-1920s, America was changing. Jazz in the streets, new freedoms, new fears. Yet for women who stepped outside the expected lines, the punishment remained old-fashioned. Nan watched the years move past her daughter's window. She watched Elizabeth Ann learn to walk, to read, to ask questions that had no safe answers. She began to believe that silence might not protect them after all. There was only one way she could imagine giving her daughter a place in history: by writing it down. Could a book be stronger than a presidency? Could ink do what loyalty never could? The threshold. So Nan Britton faced a choice few people ever meet: remain quiet and let the past be decided by others, or speak and risk being called every name the country reserved for difficult women. She chose to speak. That decision would open a storm she could not control, a storm that would follow her for the rest of her life. But it would also plant a seed that waited almost 100 years to bloom. This is where the story turns from private memory to public battle. A single woman preparing to challenge a national legend, a daughter growing up between truth and doubt, a country about to discover how uncomfortable history can feel. Nan Britton was about to publish her secret, and America was about to decide whether it wanted to listen. The answer would not be gentle. In 1927, one woman placed a match beside American history, and the country decided she was the fire. Nan Britton published a book called The President's Daughter. Inside it, she described a private relationship with Warren G. Harding, and the child she said was his. With those pages, a secret moved from whispers into print. And America had to choose: protect a dead president or listen to a living woman. But what happens when truth sounds like scandal? Who decides which one it becomes? A book enters the world. The book arrived in bookstores like an unexpected guest. Newspapers, including the Chicago Tribune and the Boston Globe, covered it as a national controversy. People bought copies quietly, as if the cover itself might recognize them. Some read it in one long breath. Others refused to touch it at all. The language felt bold for 1927, direct, personal, unashamed. Nan Britton wrote as a mother first and a witness second. She named names, she described meetings, she spoke about money, fear, and loyalty. Could a single book rewrite a presidency, or would the presidency rewrite the book? The country divides. America answered in two voices. Editorials from the period show a sharply divided response, some outlets condemning the book as immoral, others admitting the story could not be easily dismissed. Church leaders called it indecent. City officials in Boston attempted to ban its sale. Booksellers placed it behind counters like contraband. Yet the more it was condemned, the more it was read. In dining rooms and barber shops, strangers argued the same question: was Nan Britton brave, or was she lying? And if she was lying, why did her story refuse to fade? The Harding family responded. To them, the book was not testimony. It was an attack on a man who could no longer defend himself. Relatives, political allies, and former aides spoke with one voice. The story was impossible. One claim echoed louder than the rest, that Warren Harding could not have fathered children at all. No medical records supporting that claim have ever been publicly produced, a gap later historians would repeatedly note. But in the 1920s, proof mattered less than certainty, and certainty belonged to the powerful. How fragile is one woman's memory when it stands beside a monument? The cost of speaking. For Nan Britton, the debate was not abstract. Friends stopped calling. Landlords asked uncomfortable questions. Letters arrived filled with anger and threats. She walked into restaurants and felt the room change temperature. Her daughter grew old enough to notice the stares. Elizabeth Ann did not understand the word scandal, only that it followed her mother like a shadow. What does a child inherit when history argues about her name? The file that grew in silence. Behind the headlines, another story was unfolding. Declassified FBI records from the late 1920s confirmed that agents opened a file on Britton after the book's publication, focusing on possible blackmail allegations. Investigators spoke with neighbors, employers, acquaintances. They wrote reports in careful typewriter ink, stacking pages that few people would see for decades. Those same records show the inquiry ended without charges and documented no evidence of extortion. Yet the attention itself was enough to tighten the walls around her life. Power does not always shout. Sometimes it simply watches. Nan began to disappear from public view. She stopped giving interviews. She avoided questions that felt like traps. Work became harder to find. Elizabeth Ann learned that her father was a topic to be handled gently, like a fragile plate at the edge of a table. The country moved on to other stories, elections, radio shows, the roar of a new decade. But the book remained, a stubborn witness on library shelves. Could a story survive when the storyteller was forced into silence? As years passed, scholars approached Britton's account with caution. Most Harding biographers described the story as unproven, reflecting the limits of evidence available before modern DNA testing. Footnotes replaced headlines. Doubt became a habit of language. To Elizabeth Ann, the debate felt distant and personal at once. She married, raised children, lived a life far from Washington. Within the family, the story was spoken quietly, like an heirloom too delicate for strangers. How long can a question live without an answer? A country changes, a secret remains. The Roaring Twenties gave way to the Depression, then another war. New presidents took office and left it again. America learned to forget what was uncomfortable. Nan Britton grew older, watching her daughter become a woman, watching the world move further from the year her life had split in two. She kept the book in print when she could. She answered letters from readers who believed her, and she endured the louder voices that did not. What is braver, speaking once or refusing to take it back? Elizabeth Ann's quiet life. Elizabeth Ann Blaesing lived with a complicated inheritance. To classmates, she was simply another girl. At home, she was the child of a story half the country mocked. Those who knew her later described a gentle, private woman who carried her mother's burden without bitterness. She rarely sought attention. She rarely corrected strangers. But inside the family, the question never disappeared. Was the past true? And who would still be alive when the answer finally arrived? The Long Shadow. By the time Nan Britton reached old age, the book that had once shaken the nation was treated as a historical curiosity. Libraries catalogued it. Researchers quoted it with careful distance. The storm had become weather, always present, rarely noticed. Nan died in 1991, at the age of 91, still without the recognition she had hoped for. Elizabeth Ann would follow in 2005. The story appeared to close like so many others, unsettled, uncertain, unfinished. But history sometimes waits for tools it does not yet possess. A door reopens. In 2014, Nan's grandson, James Blaesing, decided he wanted more than family legend. He wanted proof. Modern genetics offered what memory could not: a simple swab, a comparison, a number. The Harding family agreed to participate. After nearly a century, the argument would be tested not by opinion, but by science. Could a laboratory do what newspapers, courts, and scholars never had? The stage is set. Samples were taken. Weeks passed in ordinary silence. No marching bands, no headlines yet. Only a question traveling through machines. And when the answer arrived in July 2015, it would speak more clearly than any book ever had. The storm Nan Britton had walked through was about to change direction. What if history was not written in stone, but in blood? In 2015, a small envelope crossed a laboratory desk in the United States. Inside were DNA results that would answer a question older than most living Americans. Was Nan Britton telling the truth? After 90 years, science finally replied. But what does proof mean when the people who needed it most are already gone? The final chapter began not with politicians or historians, but with a grandson. James Blaesing had grown up hearing the family story, that his grandmother, Nan, had loved a president, and that his mother, Elizabeth Ann, was that president's child. For decades, the claim felt like a rumor dressed as inheritance. James decided he wanted more than memory. He wanted certainty. Modern genetics offered something the 1920s never could, a test that did not care about reputation. Could a cotton swab succeed where a century of arguments had failed? Members of the Harding family agreed to participate. Some were curious, some cautious, all aware that the result would rewrite a branch of their own tree. Samples were collected quietly, without ceremony. No crowds, no cameras, just science preparing to speak. In 2015, an AncestryDNA study comparing descendants of both families found a 99.9% probability of shared ancestry. Numbers rarely sound emotional, yet these did. How loud can a single percentage become? Major outlets, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, reported the Harding family's acknowledgement of the results that same year. After 90 years of doubt, the argument ended in a single season. Warren G. Harding had fathered a daughter. Nan Britton had not invented her life. The country that once mocked her now printed apologies in careful columns. But apologies travel slowly when the people they are meant for have already left the room.
Nan Britton died in 1991. Elizabeth Ann in 2005. Neither heard the sentence that might have changed everything. She was telling the truth. James Blaesing later said his grandmother wanted only one thing: to be believed. Not wealth, not fame, simply dignity. What is the price of being right too early? A complicated legacy. The DNA result did more than settle a family question. It forced historians to look again at the man at the center. Recent scholars describe Harding as a figure of contradictions, praising his civil rights speeches while acknowledging the corruption that scarred his administration. He was capable of progress and failure in the same breath, like many men who walk through power. Elizabeth Ann lived inside those contradictions her entire life, a private woman carrying a public mystery. Can a child inherit a presidency the way others inherit a surname? Evidence changed. Before genetics, insistence was not evidence. And without evidence, stories like Nan's were easily folded into gossip. The laboratory did not rewrite the past, it simply illuminated it. A name once whispered became part of official record. A family tree gained a branch that had waited nearly a century. How many other branches remain unseen? The silence between generations. Think about the years in between. Elizabeth Ann growing up without a recognized father. Nan growing older with a reputation she could never fully repair. Grandchildren hearing a tale they could not defend. History often measures presidents by monuments. It measures women like Nan by rumors. The DNA result balanced that scale a little, though far too late for comfort. If justice arrives after the funeral, is it still justice?
Today, Elizabeth Ann Blaesing is listed in the Harding genealogy.
Her descendants are acknowledged as part of a presidential line. On paper, the change is small, a few lines in an archive. In human terms, it is enormous. A lifetime of doubt replaced by a single sentence of fact. With DNA evidence now part of the historical record, scholars generally agree that the question of paternity has been conclusively resolved. But a record can be corrected without healing the people who lived the error. This story is not only about one president or one affair. It is about how societies choose which voices to trust, about how easily power can decide what sounds believable. Before DNA, many women who spoke inconvenient truths were dismissed as unstable, greedy, or confused. Nan Britton was simply the rare case where the future learned to listen. How many others never received that courtesy? Truth moves at different speeds. For the powerful, it can wait comfortably behind marble walls. For the vulnerable, it presses like weather against the door. Nan believed that words might be enough. For decades they were not. But words can be patient. They can wait for a tool strong enough to carry them. And sometimes that tool is born long after the storyteller. Imagine Elizabeth Ann as a child asking questions her mother answered carefully. Imagine Nan deciding each day whether to speak or to stay quiet. Their lives were ordinary in every way except one, a single fact the world refused to grant them. The DNA test did not give them new lives. It gave them recognition they had already earned. Is recognition the same as forgiveness? History finally wrote their names without hesitation. Nan Britton, mother, writer, witness. Elizabeth Ann Blaesing, daughter, teacher, quiet survivor. A story once treated as scandal is now filed as fact. Truth did not arrive with a parade. It arrived in a laboratory envelope, in a number that could not be argued away. This was the story of a daughter kept in shadow and a mother who refused to let her disappear. A reminder that the past is not finished until someone has the courage and sometimes the science to ask one more question. Nan Britton, 1996, 1901. Elizabeth Ann Blaesing, 1919, 2005. Their truth survived.